Hello, I'm Grant. Welcome to Second Plate, a cooking show that focuses on reusing ingredients and using what you already have in your home. So tonight we're going to be making a cherry cobbler. It's functionally very similar to a pie for what you would make it for, but it's a lot easier. You can make it with things you already have in your kitchen, and it's just a great staple to have in your repertoire to pull out on nights where you are camping, having people over but didn't prepare a dessert, or just you want something that's nice and warm without all the prep work for a pie or something like that. So let's get cooking. So I'm gonna start here. I just have a cast iron little dish here, and I was actually gonna start this show with basically a story. One of the reasons I wanted to do this is when I was in Boy Scouts, we would always make cobbler as our go-to dessert because if you have a Dutch oven like this, you can actually cook it really easily just in a campfire. If you use charcoals or even just wood, you basically just put it in there, cover it up, and you just kind of keep an eye on it with time, and it's surprisingly effective. And it's so cool that you don't really have to know anything like different than cooking with a normal oven, but it's a great dessert to pull out on a cold winter night. So I have some just cherry pie filling here. This is with syrup added in. I'm going to start by actually spraying my pan down because as good as I would like to be with seasoning my cast iron stuff, might get a little bit of sticking. Not that it's a terribly bad thing with cobbler, but I'm essentially going to make it in this bowl as we go through. So I got my cherries out. I am preheating my oven for 350 degrees, and then I'm going to start with the actual filling and seasoning. So I have this here. This is going to look like flour, but this is actually just baking mix. It's basically a bunch of really common ingredients, primarily flour, already mixed together. And if you want, you could make it with full on flour, add your own, I assume salt, add baking soda, stuff like that. But I want to call this out because this is something I think most people probably already have. Basically, it's functionally no different than a pre-made cake mix or like a pancake mix. So it's something that you probably have in your home that you would probably earmark for some other use, but it's actually incredibly convenient just to kind of have around for a couple different uses. And just the fact that you can throw this together by saying, okay, I'm gonna get some pie filling, maybe you just have some in your pantry, and then I'm gonna get some baking mix to round it out. It's very easy for you to last minute toss together a dessert without, say, all the trouble of a homemade pie. But I'm just adding a decent amount in, probably about half a cup, and mixing it up a little bit, making sure there's no large lumps. What this is going to do is it's going to help give this a little bit more form. It'll stick together, and that helps it just not be so obviously just a pie filling tossed in here. Actually, it's the same recipe you can actually use with actual fresh fruits, like peaches I know is a very common one. You can basically just put it in, and you just add the ingredients as you normally would. But I enjoy this because I wanted to kind of highlight the fact that it's pretty easy to do just as is. So I got some ground nutmeg. I'm going to toss in. Turn down my butter that's heating up. Got some allspice. I would normally add cloves as well, but I couldn't find it on my way over. But I think of these three ingredients of nutmeg, clove, and allspice as being basically my go-to banana bread seasonings, is how I kind of think of it. And I just think it gives off kind of like a homey Thanksgiving vibe, and that's kind of what I'm going with in my cobbler. Okay, mix that. I have cinnamon sugar. You can also add just straight cinnamon and then sugar. Mix it up. Again, your call. I like to put the majority of the seasoning actually in the topping, not inside the filling itself. Just add a little bit of butter and save the rest for my coating. And again, this is just to make it be a little bit more than just regular pie filling. Give it kind of form and more of a consistent taste throughout the cobbler. So you're not like, oh, this has got this awesome filling, and you bite down, it's like, oh, this is generic, filler. Cool, so we're gonna have that. I'm just gonna go around with my spatula to get a nice, hard, clean edge as best I can. because one thing that I think is important to note is I do intend to actually serve it from this dish. Cobbler generally is not something I see you taking out and putting in another dish. Like you will obviously get like say a bowl, but normally I think the big point of cobbler is it's all just kind of like put together in like a Dutch oven and you like really dig in and grab your, I guess, bits. And as part of that, the inconsistency is kind of the allure. Like you'll notice when we get to the actual topping, we'll be distributing it unevenly to kind of give certain like shallower sections and certain deeper sections. So I'm just going to set this to one side for a second and move on to our topping. One thing I really like about working with this cobbler is functionally the topping can be pretty much all over the place. Like you can get a really nice, awesome looking topping, but I literally had one time where it came out where it was a little more than a pancake essentially sitting in my cobbler, and even then like it doesn't necessarily look as good. Like you don't get that fancy like photo shot, but you still get that awesome breading and like layering when you actually dig in and you mix it up with the pie filling. So I'm just going to add more of my baking mix. I'm going to add actually about a fourth. Let's do 3/4 of a cup. Really the amounts on this can kind of vary with what you have around. Again, one of the really nice things is why you can just throw it together. I'm going to break up any large chunks. I like to start with the dry ingredients first, and we'll be doing basically the same thing we just did before. I'm going to be adding some ground allspice. I'm going to be pretty thick with this since like I said, I'm putting the majority of my seasonings actually in the topping. So I want it to be a strong enough flavor that it still tastes good when you're actually mixing it on your plate with the pie filling. Cool. Keep mixing that up. And now it actually reminds me of one thing I forgot with this is the probably central component, which is a fair bit of sugar. This is something where functionally, like chemically, the sugar is not required, but this is a dessert. So obviously go nuts with how much or how little you want. Same thing with like butter in a lot of dishes where it's like, I'm not gonna say you should put like a ridiculous amount of butter in, but I'm also, like to be real, the more you put in, the better it's probably gonna taste in most cases. So you just kind of have to feel it out. It also helps if you pay attention to whether or not there's already sugar in your pie filling. This already has some in it. Whereas if you get sugar-free, you want to make sure you actually put a little bit more in just so you get that like sweetness. And also as it cooks, the sugar will give it a little bit more, obviously more flavor, but also it'll help bind it all together as it kind of caramelizes. Cool. Let me add a little bit more of this. I'm trying to balance this with my dry ingredients before I add some of these wet. One thing I would also recommend that makes this very convenient is one, you can make this ahead of time, particularly the dough, and just freeze it, or not freeze it, refrigerate it. And then this is actually really convenient if you want to make several different types of cobbler. So say if I had 3 to 4 miniature pots of this, you can just make one batch of your essentially topping, covering, and then you can just say, okay, this one's peaches, cherry, blueberry, all these kinds. And I think that's a nice way to kind of distribute it if you have a lot of people, while also getting variety without actually adding that much work. Cool. So now we're going to add our liquid ingredients. So I just have some melted butter. You can actually add this in as a solid. Like I've seen other recipes that functionally do that by putting it through a blender. So you end up with solid but really tiny bits of butter that will melt, and that's one way to give your inconsistency. I'm going to add some milk. This is actually buttermilk I had offhand. You could also use cream. Really, the idea behind the cobbler is pretty simple. Like we're basically going to be making kind of like a bread dough covering, or not bread, cake dough. And then we're just filling it with all kinds of just goodies of sorts. So So it's looking pretty thick, so I'm just gonna add in a little bit more milk. I want this to be pretty runny, personally, because you want to be able to take a spoon and effectively dollop it onto the cobbler. So I'm just gonna keep moving around. At this point, I like to add milk, but if it is getting too thick, you can just add water. It is not a big deal at all. Clean off my whisk. I really love using whisks because they're so good at their specific job, but it's just, you always have that thought in the back of your mind, I'm gonna have to clean this. Same with my potato masher or my garlic cutter. I'm just I really want to because it's so good, but at the same time, do I want to have to worry too much about this? Cool, just add in a little bit more. Pot filling. Still looking a little thick, so I'm actually going to add a little bit of sugar and more milk, just doing it a little bit more at a time. This is actually how I end up cooking a fair bit. And it's probably why I don't bake too much, is I like to just iterate and just see is that what I want? Is that it? And that's why I probably prefer stuff like soup versus say a cake where you need to be a lot more specific going in. And once you start cooking, it's pretty hard to change the consistency of your cake while it's cooking. But now we can start to see it's a little bit more liquidy, where it kind of comes up and dollops off. And that's basically what I'm going to be looking for. So I'm just going to taste. That's surprisingly hot from the butter still. A little bit more sugar. Cool. I'm going to add some of the cinnamon. And this is all personal preference. This is the kind of thing where I assume, or rather the way I would see myself doing this is a very easy recipe to describe to people and to explain the logistics of it. But if you just say you make this every couple months for some family gathering, you will slowly build up your own internal preference for a lot of these. So I could easily see myself saying you know what, I'm really just not a huge fan of cinnamon, but I really want to introduce some other kind of flavoring. Because it's so simple that basically anything you could do with a pie, you could do with this. So it really opens up the world with what you happen to have on hand, or if you were trying to make this a dessert for a Thanksgiving dinner, bring in some of those same herbs so that there's a consistency. And then all of a sudden it's you have your own little kind of custom recipe. And I assume that's how a lot of people end up with age-old family recipes, is just they kept cooking it over and over and just changing it. All right. I'm going to clean off my whisk here. And we're going to get this in the oven. It takes about 50 minutes to an hour to actually cook. And while that could seem like a fair bit of time, it's actually extremely hands-off, and that's kind of what I like about it, is I can basically prep this and put this in, go cook and eat dinner, and then you just come back and okay, is it looking good? Yep, it is. Bring it out and serve it hot. So, this will be fine. So I'm going to go through and, like many things in cobbler, this step is a little bit optional, but I'm going to be kind of dolloping it around because I want, like I said before, those kind of inconsistencies. So if you are someone who wants a lot of that dough breading, you can kind of go in for one of the larger chunks. But if you are more of a pie filling person, go for some of the lighter areas. Cool, like so. And then I'm going to carefully try to just stir it just a little bit. The way I kind of think of this is if you ever try to make, say, a marble bread, I'm trying to stir it a little bit vertically instead of horizontally because I don't want to swirl, but I do want some of my dough to penetrate just a little bit in. So I'm just going to kind of lap a little bit of that up and respread it out. And again, this is just to further give a little bit more to the pie filling to be more than just pie filling. You'll get little bits of dough actually deep down. And that also helps solve the issue of, say, one person kind of coming in through and just taking all of the topping, just like accidentally, and then having nothing but the dregs on the bottom, which are still good because we've mixed other stuff too. But it's a nice little, I think, detail we can cover. Cool. I'm gonna go ahead and then spread this out. Again, I've got my varied thickness, but now I do want to actually make sure there's a fair bit of covering all around, like so. At this point, if it's looking still a little bit, like you can't cover the whole pot, because like it's gonna be very specific to your Dutch oven or lasagna dish. You could honestly make this into a lasagna dish. Just bring it back, add in some more of your baking mix, and you'll be good. Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and add this in right here to the oven. It's set to 350 for about 1 hour, but I like to leave the lid off since I'm not actually doing it in a bonfire. And that lets me just kind of keep a very simple, clean eye on it. So I'm just going to toss this in and come back in 1 hour. After about 50 minutes to 1 hour, your cobbler is going to be looking pretty brown based off the size of the crust. It will vary depending on the size of your actual dish, as well as how deep it is. Obviously, if you're going to make a large batch of this, you're going to have to like leave it in at a lower temperature a little bit longer, just to make sure it's all nice and consistently cooked through. So I'm just going to bring this here and take a look at it. So here we have our cobbler, currently as is. One thing I like is you'll notice I actually added about a whole stick of butter, more or less, to the topping. And the goal of that is that's how you're going to get a fair bit of like this browning here. And that's kind of the key goal. I've definitely underdone the butter. And you end up with, like I said before, like almost like a pancake because you don't get that same reaction. But that's what I'm looking for. And this is somewhere where you have to decide kind of what you're going for, because you can go for like a really soft dough and it's really nice. It's like really good with, say, like ice cream, because you can really mix it together a lot more. However, a different approach is to go a little bit more like this, where you get a very hard edge. So then you're contrasting, say, the hard edge of the topping with the softness of the cobbler. So normally the biggest thing you would do with cobbler is you would serve it with ice cream. We just have some simple vanilla ice cream here. And the goal of cobbler is you bring it out, you take it off, and you just let people dig in, because the reason the ice cream works so well with it is that you can just have them right next to each other and they just immediately contrast with the, honestly, probably still very hot, steaming cobbler once you dig into it, and then the really nice, like, smooth, creamy ice cream. Plus, it really is just a good moment just to be like, here you go, versus like trying to, like, say, cut up a pie or a cake. This is just a really nice, like, dish that I think just like reminds a lot of people of like home, because there's no real like pomp and circumstance to it. It's totally something I could see someone's mother like cooking in the dead of winter that everyone looks forward to and is just kind of a family event. Once the cobbler's done, the only thing left is to just actually dig into it. So I'm going to go ahead and start with this bowl. The ice cream is a topping, so I'm going to start with my cobbler. Again, a big point of cobbler is contrasting the hardness of the topping with the pastry. So I want to get a nice little varied amount, so I'm going to start over here and get some pastry just on the very bottom. I say this like it's a big science, but really, I think most people, if you've had cobbler before, you kind of know what you want. But I do think it's important to like get a nice separation. So you're not just like, okay, I eat all the topping, and then I eat all of the filling. And you can kind of see even more now how by us turning it before, doing that kind of like vertical stuff, you get this deeper like dough that lets you like space it out very, very nicely, versus just having effectively a hard pancake on top of your cobbler. Right there. Finish it off with some ice cream. I think also that one of the things I like about this is how much you can just leave up to other people's hands and just how much you can let them mix and match. Like, hey, make two types of cobbler, get 2 types of ice cream, and then that's like, what, 4 combinations that can really satisfy pretty much everyone. And it's all very hands-off and easy to do. So here we have our finished cobbler with ice cream. So that's our finished cobbler. I can't recommend it enough. I have a ton of really fond memories of making it in Boy Scouts just on a cold winter camp out and it being the highlight because it's so easy. You can have a bunch of teenagers cook it for you, but it always comes out really nice. It's always just like just what you want and you can really mix and match with it. I heavily recommend it as something to try out in the coming winter just to really like spice it up and make some nice desserts without too much hassle. This has been Second Plate, a show that focuses on reusing ingredients and using what you have on hand at home. I'll see you again next week.